Cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. Greetings, Chairperson, distinguished judges, deserving opponents, and audience. As the first speaker of the proposing team, I, Francis Dorick, strongly endorse the motion. Cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. My team does not seek to dismiss or denigrate all cultural traditions in Guyana. We celebrate cultural richness and heritage. However, we do believe some traditions or interpretations of them are abused or used to justify and promote domestic violence and gender inequality. I will present three key points that are backed up by actual data from Guyana and the larger Caribbean region. Traditional gender roles reinforce male dominance and condone inequalities. Cultural norms in many Guyanese communities emphasize that a woman's traditional role is to take care of her family and be obedient to the male head of the household. In Guyana, 50% of women say that they have been victims of violence at some point in their lives, according to the Caribbean Women Count Data Hub. Additionally, studies show that the higher rates of violence against women in the Caribbean are linked to a perception that a man is the natural head of the household. A power imbalance is created when cultural custom dictates that men must rule the home. This imbalance is all too frequently used as an excuse for abusive behavior and physical or psychological abuse. Harmful social norms and attitudes legitimize domestic abuse under the guise of tradition. According to data from the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey 2019, roughly 17.9% of women in Guyana believe that a husband could beat his wife for at least one of the 10 reasons, such as nothing goes without telling him. According to the qualitative research conducted in Guyana, the social fabric includes a number of underlying attitudes, including maintaining the male head of family, male entitlement, and discipline of wives. These beliefs are often wrapped up in cultural language. That is how it is always done, or it's our way, I quote. In these cases, culture becomes the cover for inequality and abuse rather than a shield against it. High prevalence of violence and weak enforcement underscore the misuse of culture as an excuse. In the Caribbean, Guyana has one of its highest rates of violence against women. For instance, according to the World Bank profile, 55% of women between the ages of 15 and 64 had at least one instance of violence in their lifetime. Around 4 out of 10 had been victims of physical or sexual abuse. Additionally, attitudes on domestic abuse continue to exist, those from poorer backgrounds and interior regions are more inclined to defend husband-to-wife violence. Even with laws like Guyana's Domestic Violence Act 1996, awareness is low and enforcement is inconsistent. In Guyana, almost 65% of women were not aware that the act was meant to protect them. These facts tell us that culture, when misapplied, can be used as an excuse for inequality and violence, rather than challenged. In closing, tradition should uplift and strengthen every member of society, but we have to question it when it is used to legitimize male dominance, suppress victims, and normalize abuse. The motion is therefore both essential and appropriate. Rebuttal. Cultural is not the cause. Abusers misuse culture, not tradition itself. We acknowledge that culture is not fundamental, violent, or unfair. However, our motion is clear, sometimes used as excuses to justify domestic violence and gender inequality. The argument is that some people exploit specific practices as an excuse or cover for abuse. For instance, a man may use culture as a shield by saying things like, "This is how it was always done in our family," or "My culture demands I discipline my wife." We can see how potent these cultural justifications can be given that 17.9% of women in Guyana said they think a husband is justified in beating his wife for specific reasons. Hence, the claim made by the opposition that culture is innocent misses the fact that tradition is being used in various ways. Guyana, Guyana is changing. Modern laws and attitudes mean culture no longer justifies domestic violence. The evidence indicates that a strong tradition-based rational system is still in place, despite the fact that awareness efforts and legislative reforms are in progress. According to the World Bank research, one of the issues is beliefs that connect family values to the upholding of a male leader in the household despite physical abuse. Furthermore, beliefs that excuse violence are more common in rural and interior areas, as well as in homes with lower incomes. Therefore, it would be naive to say that culture no longer matters. In reality, it still does, particularly in areas with slower socioeconomic progress. The other side must demonstrate where and how culture no longer serves as an excuse. We have demonstrated several instances where it still does. Domestic violence and gender inequality are global issues. We should not single out Guyana's culture. We acknowledge that gender-based violence is a worldwide issue. Our motion, however, is unique to Guyana and consequently Caribbean contexts, and we have included Caribbean data. For instance, studies conducted throughout the Caribbean indicate that uneven power arrangements, male as head of the household, lead to greater rates of intimate partner violence. Given the high frequency of violence, 55% lifetime for women, and data on cultural attitudes in the Guyanese setting, it is evident that cultural tradition is one of the contributing factors and is therefore appropriately subject to debate. Hence, while it is a worldwide problem, we are not escaping it. We chose to focus on the role that Guyana's culture plays in this specific system. Closing statement. Finally, I want to emphasize that we are against the misuse of culture, not the culture itself. Traditions lose their moral validity when they are misused to uphold male power, suppress victims, justify domestic abuse. The evidence gathered from Guyana demonstrates that actual influence of cultural attitudes. In Guyana, 55% of women report experiencing violence at some point in their lives. 17.9% of women concur that the husband has the right to beat his wife. And many think that men are inherently the heads of the household. In order to achieve gender equality and put an end to domestic violence, cultural explanations must be challenged, and as evidenced by the continuation of such views, particularly in rural and interior areas. Therefore, I kindly request your support for the motion stating cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence, to turn culture from an umbrella of exploitation into a basis of quality and respect. It is important for us to acknowledge what is true. Thank you. I rest my case.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Anisha Rodriguez, your speaker number one for the opposing side, and I strongly disagree with a motion that says cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. Reason why we disagree with this are that cultural traditions are used to show love and respect, not domestic violence or domestic abuse. There are different reasons why domestic abuse happens. For example, anger issues, etc. And I repeat, not by cultural tradition. In Guyana, our cultural tradition is used to show respect for each other and not violence. According to Guyana Times 2025, it is a time when people from all backgrounds come together and share in the spirit of togetherness. It also states that we should always embrace the value of unity, tolerance, and respect for all. For example, sharing food around Christmas or Diwali time, helping neighbors fix something at their home, and even respecting our elders when we see them, even if it's just a greeting. This shows the love, respect, and unity that cultural tradition bring. It does not tell someone to hurt or disrespect others. If you do see someone being violent, that is on their self, not cultural tradition. Cultural traditions today are helping to stop violence and gender inequality. According to Barbation Celebrate Women's Day, Department of Public Health 2019, it is now said that cultural tradition is helping women to promote their strength and integrity. For example, back in the days, you wouldn't have found women going to work or even attending school. But now we have young and old women being the main providers for their household. This clearly shows that this is the reason why cultural tradition should not be used as an excuse for gender inequality. In conclusion, cultural tradition in Guyana should not be used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. There are a lot of other factors that can be used as an excuse for inequality and domestic abuse, like mental health, educational gaps, and even anger issues, not our cultural tradition. Our tradition teaches us to love, respect, and unite with everyone, just as our motto says, one people, one nation, and one destiny. That is why we disagree with the motion. Thank you.
Colleagues, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen. Today, my teammates and I highly endorse the motion cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. In fact, many women and girls face such circumstances in Guyana. Guyana is a diversified country, and culture should be treated as an engine to bring us together. Guyana has a heterogeneous culture of indigenous peoples, Indo and Afro-Guyanese, inclusive of mixed customs. Despite this, people are constantly misguided and enforce the patriarchal conventions such as 1. Women are sole caregivers. Women are often looked down upon, while men are paramount in the home. This leads to inconsistent roles and is subject to abuse. 2. Religious expectations. In cases where there is abuse due to religious practices, women are forced to stay in their relationships to save their marriage. A University of Guyana Gender Studies research highlights that the dominance of men's superiority over women paves the way for gender inequality as a result of cultural customs and practices. Men feel as if women are entitled to them. This only reinforces the statement and is the reality of cultural traditions abused for the gain of authority. In the Guyana Chronicle, a statement that reiterates, and I quote, according to the World Bank, 8.8 women per 100,000 are killed due to femicide in Guyana. Think of how many were under circumstances trying to save their marriage due to traditional norms. Many suggest that culture is not the issue for inequality and domestic violence. Although this is not entirely true, as culture should help us bond as Guyanese. Nevertheless, when misused to harm others, silence their voices, and undermine, it gives rise to male predominance, and there is room for inequality and domestic violence. Not all traditional customs are immoral, but a few are misguided in obtaining authority, resulting in factional gender equality. Within the Afro and Indo-Guyanese cultures, women are usually expected to be strong to withstand their partner's marriage miseries. Because of this, women are relentlessly trapped in an abusive cycle. Our adversaries might even mention Guyana's legislative progress, like the Domestic Violence and Sexual Offences Act. Those are admirable, but have you seen the headlines? The same act enforces remains weak. Rightly said by the Guyana Human Rights Association, countless complaints are silenced, unreported due to fear of public repercussions. These victims are told, "Where would you go if you leave?" or "Give it time, he will change," which are strongly linked to enculturation. Guyana is continuously progressing, as research shows that intimate partner violence diminished by 34.1%. Although this is so, inequality and domestic violence are quite prevalent, and something must be done to manage this issue. The education system is rapidly evolving. Again, while this is so, there are imbalances. Our hinterland has high rates of domestic violence. Rooted in cultural traditions, they remain with their abusive husbands because they are the heads of the home. Quite stereotypical. A United Nations Women Report for 2023 discovered that over 40% of women in Guyana are living under plain circumstances of domestic abuse and believe they can be justified. Subsequently, one can argue that men are also victims, while the focus on women alone is inequitable. This is no doubt, as we should all be treated fairly. However, women endure the impingement of gender-based domestic violence according to statistics. Therefore, we must address the unbearable truth that cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes misused as an excuse to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. We are not doing away with our culture. Rather, we must encourage our societies to practice it positively, enlighten our brothers and sisters to voice their concern without fearfulness, reform regulations to protect victims, and impose legal consequences for abusers. Our culture should be unique and an engine for harmony. It should not be abused to harm others. Our culture should uplift, bring together, be preserved, and not oppress. We have something beautiful in our culture: the music, dances, and customs. Leaders and elders, let us teach and practice it in the right way, not for our brothers and sisters to be victims. Thank you.
Distinguished judges, colleagues, and fellow debaters, a pleasant good afternoon to you all. We, the opposition, strongly disagree with the motion that cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as an excuse to justify gender inequality and domestic violence. To us, culture itself isn't the problem. It is the way individuals twist or misuse practices that fuel inequality and violence. Guyana's traditions, drawn from a blend of African, Indian, indigenous, Portuguese, Chinese, and European roots, are fundamentally anchored in love, unity, and respect. Family gatherings, sacred religious rites, and everyday community cooperation all convey the message: we are meant to look out for one another, not to harm or mistreat each other. When a person resorts to violence or treats someone unfairly, that act springs from a choice, not from our cultural directive. To hold decades of generations of traditions accountable for the misdeeds of a few individuals is both unfair and fundamentally misguided. UNICEF Guyana, UNICEF 2025 observes that attitudes that rationalize abuse, such as the belief that a husband has a right to hit his wife, was largely rooted in social norms and skewed power structures rather than in any traditional or religious customs. The Guyana Human Rights Association U.S. Department of State 2022 assessment also corroborated that most of the nation's denominations and cultural organizations openly repudiate domestic violence while actively promoting gender-based respect. Rather than casting aside our culture, we can turn it into a teaching tool for respect, gender equality, and the strength of community tools. Accordingly, the opposition stands resolute, defending traditions as well as strong source of wisdom, not a cover for harm. Madam Chairperson, judges, and esteemed audience, the proposition contends that culture functions as a shield from violence and gender inequality. The opposition, however, retorts this is not culture but a perversion of it. The opposition side might point to customs or times sworn saying that on inspection appear to privilege men over women. Those, however, are misinterpreted notions, far removed from the core of our traditions. In Guyana, a considerable array of values genuinely fosters equilibrium and reciprocal respect. Take indigenous societies where women have long been celebrated as both leaders and the caring heart of their communities. In the tapestries of Hinduism and Christianity, women are likewise esteemed and honored as the mother and as the guided teacher. The Women and Gender Equality Commission of Guyana, Women and Gender Equality Commission 22, pointed out that domestic violence and inequality are closely tied to unemployment, poverty, and a lack of education to beliefs. UNESCO Caribbean Culture Report, Kingston 2022, point out that customs, think, village self-help, and religious celebrations knit men and women, not tear them apart. When an individual resorts to actions and then claims, "That's my culture," they're contorting the idea of culture into a flimsy shield for their own wrongdoing. The blame rests on the people involved and on the inadequacy of enforcement, not my culture itself. In fact, culture can serve as a lever for change. A substantial number of neighborhoods repurpose their religious festives as platforms for anti-violence education and the promotion of equality. Consider, for instance, the Purple Ribbon campaign and its companion interfaith programs, both bolstered by UNFPA's 2023 support, that tap into Guyanese patchwork of religious life to nurture respect while repudiating gender-based violence. So rather than scapegoating our traditions, the emphasis ought to move toward education, awareness, and vigorous law enforcement to curb abuse. In this light, culture can serve as a remedy, not a source of trouble. Madam Chairperson, judges, and audience, I wish to stress that Guyana's cultural traditions ought not to be held responsible for the gender inequality and domestic violence that persist. Our heritage is founded on respect, love, and the unity of families. Those who commit violence are in truth fracturing these traditions of honoring them. A clear demarcation between culture and abuse is necessary. Culture serves as a guide towards tranquil coexistence. Abuse and conversely annihilates and that tranquility. According to UNFPA's 2023 report, UNFPA 2022 to 2023, the primary drivers of gender-based violence in Guyana are entrenched in social norms, weak enforcement, not the nation's cultural heritage. With its hurdles, Guyana ranks sixth in the Caribbean on the gender equality ranking according to the 2022 Global Gender Gap Report, showing that our cultural traditions can grow stronger while still championing equality. World Economic Forum 2022. Rather than launching an assault on the culture that defines us, we can channel its influence towards fostering fairness and respect. Culture should never be used as a justification for wrongdoing. It is, in fact, the foundation for doing what is right. Thank you.
Judges, worthy competitors, ladies and gentlemen, other team members presenting the idea. I wholeheartedly endorse the motion. Cultural tradition in Guyana are occasionally used as arguments to justify gender injustice and domestic abuse. As the third speaker for the proposition, our group has demonstrated unequivocally that while Guyana's traditional customs are beautiful and diverse, they are sometimes misused to support harmful gender norms and provide an excuse for violence against women. To support our point, we look at views of two famous thinkers on gender and culture. In her theory of gender performativity, 1990, feminist philosopher Judith Butler maintains that gender roles are not innate. Rather, they are acted according to what society and culture teach us. Men are frequently taught to be dominating and women to be subservient in Guyana society. These performances are recognized as tradition when they are carried out repeatedly by successive generations. Because of this normalization, cruelty and inequality can be excused as cultural norms. Secondly, Pierre Bourdieu, in his work Masculine Domination 1998, introduced the concept of symbolic violence, the subtle way culture legitimizes power and control. When society tells a woman that a good wife must obey her husband, or when religion tells her to stay silent for the sake of family honor, that is symbolic violence. It is a form of cultural control that keeps women in submissive position and excuse abuse as discipline or tradition. Hence, culture is not neutral. It shapes power, identity, and behavior, and when it is misused, it becomes a tool of oppression. The other might argue that violence is caused by individuals rather than culture. However, more than 60% of intimate partner violence occurrences in the Caribbean are influenced by cultural gender norms. According to the UNDP Human Development Report 2023, people do act, but what they think is proper is shaped by culture. They may also say that tradition protects family. Yet, the Guyana Women's Health and Life Experience Survey 2022 found that over half of abused women never report violence due to cultural shame and fear of breaking family expectations. Tradition should protect love, not silence victims. Ladies and gentlemen, instead of dividing us, culture ought to bring us together. Instead of oppressing, it ought to elevate. However, culture becomes a weapon rather than a source of pride when it is abused to suppress women or justify abuse. As Judith Butler reminds us of, and I quote, society repeats behaviors until they feel natural. As Bourdieu teaches, culture can disguise domination as love and respect. If we continue to perform inequality under the name of tradition, we are only protecting abuse, not heritage. Therefore, we, the proposition, stand firm that culture tradition in Guyana are sometimes used as excuse to justify gender inequality and domestic violence.
Greetings to all. I am Varez, the opposition's third and last speaker. The motion that cultural traditions in Guyana are sometimes used as excuses to justify gender inequality and domestic violence is strongly opposed by our team. Let me state this clearly. Culture is not the issue. The true problem is that some people misapprehend or misinterpret cultural beliefs. The six ethnic groups that make up our diversified ancestry are the source of Guyana's cultural traditions, and the principles of respect, love, and unity are at the core of each of these traditions. Diwali, Mashumani, Pagwa, and Christmas serve as reminders of compassion and unity rather than injustice and cruelty. We are not taught to treat others badly by any of our traditions. Therefore, violence is not a reflection of our culture. Rather, it is the result of a person's decision to disregard what civilization actually stands for. UNICEF Guyana claims that negative social norms and power disparities, rather than cultural or religious customs, are primary sources of ideas that justify abuse, such as the belief that a husband has the right to strike his wife. This demonstrates that social attitudes, not the custom themselves, are the issue. Furthermore, according to Guyana Human Rights, the majority of Guyana's major religious and cultural instruction oppose domestic abuse and promote gender equality. These organizations are always trying to remind people that culture should bring people together rather than driving them apart. Therefore, rather than denying our culture, we ought to embrace it and use it as a means of advancing equality and communal cohesion. Culture should not be viewed as justification for harm, but as a manual for living in harmony and respect. As I close this debate, I would like to remind that we learn to live in harmony, love, and respect from our culture. People that mistreat others are not adhering to these customs, they are breaking them. The major problem in Guyana is not a historical or phenomenon, but entrenched social norms and flawed justice. This is yet another example of how culture is being scapegoated. There is also more evidence progress. The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report ranked Guyana 35th in the world and second in the Caribbean for gender equality. That proves that our cultural values can coexist with modern ideas of fairness and equal rights. So before I leave, I'd like to offer this message. Let's stop blaming our traditions for problems they didn't cause, but use them to build a stronger, more respectful community because culture is never an excuse for bad behavior. It is the foundation of good. Thank you.